So I'm going to start at this place. Over in Iran, they're pretty strong against homosexuality. So if you're a homosexual, you've got a choice. You can either get killed, or you can change your body to the appearance of the opposite sex. So one of the things you notice with homosexuals is that generally gender non-conforming. We tend, I know it's stereotypical, but you always tend to think of gay guys as more feminine, and you always tend to think of the lesbian as more masculine or whatever. So in Iran, basically, you have to conform physically to the appearance of the opposite sex. And as I've watched some social media and seen people get so excited and exult in a lesbian becoming a trans man and removing her breasts and suffering all the consequences of those puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and surgeries, and young men who go through the same thing, removing their testicles and becoming sterile and all that thing. At the heart of this movement is actually homophobia. Now over in New Zealand, I've noticed, I haven't paid a lot of attention, but I noticed the same story that we got over here in Australia, you're getting as well. They're selling this conversion therapy bill on the backs of the pain of homosexuals in the past. Over here, what they did is a lot of crying. The politicians would get up and they'd cry about how in the past, gay people who weren't recognised for who they were, they suffered torture, getting in ice baths and electrocution and all these horrific practices, which I'm not going to go into. But all these horrific practices, and they cry and they cry and they cry, and everyone's very sympathetic and say, oh, we shouldn't have that happen again. Even though that none of those things have been happening since the 1950s, that's 60 plus years ago. They cry and talk about it and say, let's bring in this conversion therapy ban so it never's going to happen again, right? So that's what they're doing. They're piggybacking this conversion therapy ban on the back of the pain of homosexuals. Except here's the thing. What they bring in is what's called mandatory gender affirmation. And when you look at it, it's actually no different to what they do in Iran. Because what they've done over here in Victoria and Queensland and ACT is that generally when kids, young kids, and when we were talking about young kids with gender dysphoria, we're talking mainly about, firstly, the biggest group is lesbian, bisexuals and gays, and a small group is kids on the spectrum, and they found a tiny group of really intelligent kids who tend to be gender non-conforming, and these kids, they're all gay. I remember I'm going to refer to a document that I wrote for the United Nations, where I basically said that the gender identity affirmation practices targets gay children, because for the markers for making trans children, this new invention, trans children, and it is a new invention. You never heard of trans children 20 years ago, right? Or 15 years ago. It's a fairly new thing. Given the markers for trans children are gender non-conforming behaviours, it's not surprising to see that's typically gender non-conforming homosexuals or bisexuals who are classified as trans via social media and pressure. And what they saw in UK, because they're way ahead of us on this, it's really interesting that the UK are getting it, that this is a really horrific practice, and yet we're jumping into it with both feet here in Australia, and it now looks like you're jumping at both feet over there in New Zealand as well. But what they said is, what I wrote is, we've seen in the UK that the promotion of mandatory affirmation policy has shown that homosexual and bisexual children are vastly overrepresented amongst children presented to the Gender Identity Disorder Service, or gender clinics. And this was with Tavistock, which has put thousands of kids through this. What they found is that 8.5% of the girls referred to the service described themselves as heterosexual. So only 8.5% of all the girls who front up for puberty blockers and surgery to remove your breasts and stuff, only 8.5%, so over 90% of them are gay girls, are lesbians. And then what else they say? They said, although the empirical evidence has shown that a cross-sex identification is a better predictor of a child growing up to be bisexual, gay or lesbian rather than growing up to identify as trans, these children were immediately put on the medical pathway. So this happened to such an extent that the clinicians at Tavistock raised concerns that were practicing a form of gay conversion therapy. And we agree, and I agree, that this is just transing the gay away. So we've seen I've seen lesbians and gays who've been celebrating that. I'm not going to name her name, she's got purple hair. And I read her PhD paper and it sucks, it's really badly written. We've seen these guys, how their LGBTQIA group have been pushing to have gender conversion therapy bans, which is just a lie. And here's a few other things. I'm going to share with you the document I wrote and the video I put for the United Nations. But here's a few things that happened over here in Australia. You're going to see it happening over in New Zealand, I bet, because I'm noticing that everything that they're saying is the same thing they've been saying here in Australia. What you're going to be finding is that the only people who are going to be talking are those people who are the LGBTQIA and the politicians. You're going to find voices of women who are speaking on this are going to be shut down. You're going to be finding any Maori that speaks up about this, who isn't supportive of the LGBTQIA, they're going to be shut down. They're going to be called turfs and bigots, and they're going to be doxied like I've been in my work. And I tell you a bit about my work. I take marginalised youth. I take kids who are on the spectrum. I take kids who are suicidal, schizophrenic, high anxiety issues. I've had trans kids, I've had gay kids. So I have a great concern for what happens with youth. I train them for free and I put them into jobs. I'm just boasting here because I'm so proud of myself. I put them into jobs around 65 to 75k in their first jobs after only 4 months. I base my education on the old Wānanga, the courses that they used to run in Wānanga Aotearoa and Wānanga Orakawa, and they actually just shut that stuff down and they put some bullshit stuff in because it was really bloody good. So I've adopted it over here and been using it on primarily white kids just to see if it would work over here, and it definitely does work. So anyway, getting back to that, the conversion therapy with, you're going to find that they're going to be crying a lot, and they're always going to be talking about the past and how it happens. But you're going to find everybody's voices by the own are going to be shut down. And you're going to be finding that they're pushing through the mandatory affirmation policy. And you're going to find that they're going to be shutting down the voices of physicians. Like over here in Queensland, 9,600 medical practitioners spoke against this. And the reason why is because if you let these children, primarily gay children, just talk it out to people who care about them and people who love them, or talk about it to physicians and psychologists and psychiatrists, once they go through puberty, they accept that they're gay. They accept that they're not born in the wrong body, they're okay. So if you want to put love into anybody, your love really should be directed towards that it's okay to be gay. And your love should be directed towards these kids on the spectrum. And stop calling them trans children and saying being supportive of being loving is going to be taking away their breasts and taking away their genitalia and putting them through a life of loneliness and putting them through a life of sterility and putting them through a very shortened life. You know, I have to admit, on a personal note, given that my home life was quite violent, and there was over, what my aunt said was about 30 homes, but at least I remember about 16 of them, that that I've always rejected being a lesbian. I couldn't, not so much reject being a lesbian, I just thought I was just wrong, you know. So I because I felt I was wrong and never ever got into a relationship because I didn't know what it was. It wasn't until Kate of the LGBT Alliance in UK just assumed I was gay that it just kind of hit me at a very late age of 61. You know, I don't want kids to have a life of loneliness that I've had most of my life. You know, and certainly I don't want to see kids made sterile to lack the joy of having children. This practice, it's homophobic. It's not transphobic, it's homophobic. So please, one thing that's great about the Maori culture is that we've been always supportive of the people who are gay. You know, and we didn't focus on them being gay. We focused on them just being dedicated partners, you know, of people of the same sex. And that's just the last thing. So, sorry for that. At least I didn't get angry. So I focused on, I'm going to share with you the business side of things, because that's really where I come from, business, marketing, sales, tech, and things like that. And I'll talk to you in that video and a separate video about the business side of this, because behind all this is homophobia and a delicious delight that those who are hating towards children, because that's what it is, even though I've got to say in Tavistock, 35 of the physicians, they quit in a 3-year period because at least they had the decency to know what they were doing. But I'll share with you, this is a money-making thing, because on each one of those gay kids and the autistic kids, on average it's about 150k to 200k they'll make over that child's lifetime. So this is all that is, it's money. If you sit down with a loving family and you say you're okay to be who you are, there's no money to be made. But if you push them into this medical train of puberty blockers and surgery and things like that, there's a fucking truckload of money to make off them, and that's all coming out of hatred. So that's my bit about that.